Moscow says it's waiting to be briefed by Washington on the outcome of the US-Ukrainian talks in Saudi Arabia before commenting on the proposed ceasefire. This comes after Kiev said it was ready to accept a 30-day ceasefire if Moscow did the same. The Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, also said that he didn't rule out the possibility of a phone call between Presidents Putin and Trump, adding that it would be organised very quickly if needed. Well, American officials said they were preparing for a trip to Moscow with the hope that Russia will agree to the ceasefire proposal. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials say military aid and intelligence sharing from the US have resumed since agreeing to the proposal. Well, just hours after the agreement in Jeddah, Russia's attacks on Ukraine continued despite the ceasefire proposal. A woman was killed overnight in a missile strike on Kryvyi Rih, President Zelensky's hometown. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister said 4 people, all Syrian nationals, were killed in Odessa when Russia attacked a cargo ship that was being loaded with grain. For its part, Russia said it downed 21 Ukrainian drones overnight. Here's Tom Bateman in Jeddah.
The talks lasted into the night and ended with a ceasefire proposal far broader than anyone expected, demanded by the Americans and accepted by the Ukrainians. But agreeing a truce plan with only one side won't stop a war.
Today we made an offer that the Ukrainians have accepted, which is to enter into a ceasefire and into immediate negotiations to end this conflict in a way that's enduring and sustainable and accounts for their interests, their security, their ability to prosper as a nation. And hopefully we'll take this offer now to the Russians. And we hope that they'll say yes to peace. The ball's now in their court.
Mr. Zelensky said he welcomed the US truce plan.
The
American side understands our arguments, perceives our proposals, and I want to thank President Trump for the constructive conversation between our teams.
He was in Saudi Arabia, but not at the talks, in which the US has announced it will immediately reinstate its weapons supply and intelligence sharing with Ukraine.
Ukraine. Ceasefire. Ukraine, ceasefire. Just agreed to a little while ago. Now we have to go to Russia and hopefully President Putin will agree to that also, and we can get this show on the road.
The talks at this table lasted more than 8 hours. This is where they arrived at the proposal for an immediate ceasefire. But many in Europe have been deeply concerned about that, about the idea of moving to a quick truce without first negotiating the mechanism to enforce it. The talks here have grabbed the focus, even as the 3-year war they seek to end intensifies. Mr. Trump's officials will take his plan next to Moscow, a president who wants an immediate ceasefire, but on whose terms? Tom Bateman, BBC News, Jeddah.
Our Ukraine correspondent James Waterhouse is in Kiev and explained what a difference 11 days have made since those disastrous scenes in the Oval Office between President Zelensky and Trump.
I think just hearing the language from the American delegation there, that they would look to put the ball back in Russia's court and apply pressure on Moscow for the first time. The idea that Ukrainian security would be central to this agreement, it seems that, after Ukraine's European allies wanted Kiev to mend their cooperation, that seems to have happened. And just maybe this could extend into Ukraine having a shot at existing as an independent country, albeit with less territory, in the long-term future. I think it's littered with caveats, but I think the resuming of military aid and intelligence from America will be welcomed, but this is a country used to war, and it's also used to failed ceasefires. And today we've learned that the Kremlin has already had conversations with the director of the CIA, for example, so there is a channel of communication there, but this is all on what Russia makes of it and whether it wants to cooperate with the idea of immediately with the idea of a month-long ceasefire. And Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has repeated his demand, his assertion that the idea of foreign troops, NATO troops, being in Ukraine after a ceasefire is agreed is still a non-starter. It is still, in his words, unacceptable. So there are huge tension points down the line. So we wait to see what Moscow will say, what its position will be. But crucially, right now, there is clearly ongoing dialogue between America and Moscow, and This time around, it also seems to be in Ukraine's corner as well in looking to try and look after its interests. It's a diplomatic turnaround, but of course, in the era of this Trump administration, things can change quickly. But it was undoubtedly a moment from Jeddah in Saudi Arabia yesterday.
James Waterhouse in Kiev. Let's speak to James Nixey. He's the director of the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House. James, good to have you with us here on BBC News. We've heard various lines coming out of the Kremlin. They're saying, you know, let's not get ahead of ourselves with regard to this proposal, but a call between Trump and Putin could take place quickly. How should we read that?
Yes, that's right. Well, I think it's very difficult to read, of course. The conditions change so frequently, so often, and so radically, but it's like trying to nail water to a wall right now. So we should be a little bit careful of every statement that comes out of either the White House or of the Kremlin. But clearly, the Kremlin is on the back foot in terms of America's diplomatic efforts right now. It does suffer from President Trump's unpredictability just as much as the rest of us. It always said that Biden was a more predictable partner, and it preferred Biden. You can argue that one any which way you will, of course. But as far as this is concerned, then it is very unclear to me, at least, why Russia should agree to a ceasefire imposed by the US. Think about it this way. The US wants peace on any terms, but Russia wants peace on its terms. And those terms are very specific and, of course, to Ukraine's huge detriment. And to refer to the point made by your previous correspondent, then it does not wish to see Ukraine exist as an independent sovereign state. That is its sine qua non, its red line. It must subjugate Ukraine one way or another, physically, militarily, or politically. It doesn't matter too much which. But and whilst that might be acceptable to the Americans, it doesn't necessarily need to see a sovereign Ukraine in the way that the Europeans and, of course, the Ukrainians do, then there is a lot of wriggle room as far as the Americans are concerned. So the Kremlin is clearly considering this at length right now, worrying about what to do, not wishing to look overly obstinate, but nonetheless being quite clear that this will be decided in Moscow, not in Washington.
What then can the United States do to encourage or force Russia to get on board?
Well, it doesn't have many levers. And I know you could come back at me and say, well, actually, surely there are sanctions, and Trump has indeed threatened sanctions and tariffs on Russia, as you wouldn't believe. So that remains a possibility, even though we see it on-off, as we see it in other cases in the world right now. So the Russians will be mindful of that, but at the same time, they have shown an ability to exist throughout this war on very difficult premises with a very adverse economic situation. They've learned to counteract the effects of sanctions. So I don't think that is as important to them as their main drive of ultimately having a sphere of influence in the former Soviet Union. So the America's ability to put pressure on Russia is ultimately limited. True, it does not wish to see the US go full out onto Ukraine's side, but that's not as important as Russia's overall aims, ambitions, and appetites.
I mean, you've alluded to sanctions. Is that the only thing that we're likely to see then if Russia says, no, we're not having any of this?
Well, Trump has also said, of course, that he would be willing to arm Ukraine to the teeth, arm it like you've never seen it before, the usual hyperbole. And again, that would be to an extent worrying to the Russians, who are only just able to hold the line, make incremental gains in Ukraine, and incidentally in its own Kursk region, or part of which is occupied by Ukraine. So yes, there is a concern there. The war is not exactly going swimmingly well for Russia, both militarily and, of course, in terms of its perception amongst the populace at large. So at some point, Putin has to sell a victory to his people. And if he hasn't made any significant gains, then it would be a political risk to him personally and politically. So the Russian room for maneuver has radically reduced in the past couple of days, and especially, of course, with the news that the Ukrainians are now recipients, once again, of US intelligence sharing.
James, good to talk to you. Thank you very much. James Nixey from Chatham House.